Hey everybody, good to see that you're in a group this week. It's always better to do things in circles. I really believe that. Discipleship takes place in small groups, I'm convinced. So congratulations, glad you're here. What a great series we began this week, talking about being generous. Now let me ask you a question right off. How did you feel, or how do you feel, about being referred to as rich? Now probably most of us push back a little bit on that statement. We don't like being called rich because we don't think we are rich. We said Sunday that rich is a moving target, and I'm not really clear as to when we would consider ourselves rich, but certainly by the world standards, most of us here in the Western world are rich. When we realize that the average annual income for a third of the world is less than $10,000, most of us do fall into that rich category. So how did that make you feel? What are you thinking about that? Well, you may be wondering too, because I've already been asked this. So what does this have to do with anything? Because really, the whole rich thing is relevant, right? The whole rich thing is really relative to other situations. You're saying, now, Pastor Eddie, you drew those statistics, but that includes a whole lot of poor countries. That includes a lot of third world countries. And so it's all relative, really, isn't it? And so what does it have to do with anything? I think it has to do with everything because of the point that we really want to make in this series and that you can talk about a little bit tonight or today, whenever it may be. The points that we want to make are these. First of all, it's true that we need to learn to glorify God for everything He has given us to richly enjoy. Rather than becoming arrogant, rather than becoming self-glorifying, rather than taking all the credit, we need to learn to give God the glory for everything He's given us richly to enjoy, as Paul said to Timothy. That includes everything: my house, the food on my table, the car that I'm driving, no matter how raggedy it may be, the job that He's giving me. Just go right on down the list. My family, and so forth. We hope to learn to glorify God in everything. But then secondly, we hope to teach ourselves how to be rich. And what I mean by that is, since God has blessed me with so much, how do I become a good manager of that? How do I become a good manager of all the things God's given me? How do I keep from wasting what He's given me? How do I keep from just piling everything on me that He's given me? How do I share? How do I become generous? How do I put myself into an opportunity to become generous? And then corporately speaking, we hope to learn that we as a church must be generous. If we're going to reach out and if we're going to work to convince and to reach the unconvinced, there's going to have to be generosity on our parts to do that. If we're going to reach those who are unconnected, we're going to have some generous acts to do that. Or the unfinished, we have to become generous. So it's very important that we learn the lessons. Now in 1 Timothy 6, Paul warned his apprentice Timothy of the perils of wealth. He told him he would do well to remember that money affects people, and that the effects that it has on people sometimes is good, but sometimes it's not so good. And he warns us about those. And so I hope you'll take time tonight to walk through those, to look through those, look carefully at verse 17 of chapter 6, and see what Paul is saying about the perils, the snares, the traps that are out there, and how we can learn to handle or to manage our money well. But let me give you a more moment, okay? I think this, we don't have time to talk about it in the message, but you can explore it tonight. Some of the problem with us handling our wealth is we don't understand what true wealth really is. And true wealth may be, perhaps, think on this, may well be measured more by what we have left over than what we actually give. Let me show you what I mean. Look at Matthew chapter 12. And in this passage, Jesus is talking to His disciples, and He's teaching them a very important lesson. In 12 verses 41 through 44, Matthew says this, records this. He says, sitting across from the temple's treasury, He, that is Jesus, watched how the crowd dropped money into the treasury. Many rich people were putting in large sums. Okay, now keep in mind, by definition, these are rich people. He's looking at the people and their generosity in giving. And he says, here's what I note about these people. Many people with rich people were putting in large sums. Verse 42. Then a poor widow. Now, we're talking poor widow. We're talking poor not in the sense of me and you would claim to be poor. We're talking about a woman who is struggling for her daily food, for a roof over her head, for clean water readily available. The poor widow came and dropped in 2 tiny coins worth very little. Now, archaeologists and scholars have told us that it's less than a cent. In fact, they've given a name to it called a widow's mite. A very small amount, perhaps less than a penny. Now watch what happens. Summoning his disciples, verse 43, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. What? How can that be? How can it be that some are dropping large sums of money and this little lady comes and gives a fraction of a cent? How is that more? Well, Jesus said, verse 44, for they gave out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty has put everything she had, all she had to live on. So, point made and affirmed. Rich people aren't generous. Generous people are generous. And generosity is not measured by how much we give. It may well be measured by how much is left over after we give. And the truth of Paul's letter to Timothy is that we learn to manage what God's given us because it's His. He's given it to us to enjoy. And beware that we trust not in that wealth, but in Him. So again, remember our takeaway and maybe talk about this along with the questions that we provided. I will not trust in riches, but in Him who richly provides. Well, God bless you. Hope you guys have a great study and enjoy this series.